All right, welcome everybody to Dispersing the Fog. This is April 6th, 2025. I'm Adam Rodgers here with Paul Palango. We've got some interesting stories to cover this week. We're going to be taking you from from throughout Canada. We've got some stories out of Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. We're going to go down to the United States, a little bit of election coverage. We have a reference to the federal election that's ongoing. And we're going to end with a little bit of hockey history, which took place today, a couple of hours before we were recording this. So we'll come around to the big goal that was scored today. I think in Washington, but it might have been in New York. I wasn't actually. I know where the game. I know who was playing, but I'm not sure is in it. So I'm going to turn it over to Paul in a second here, but just to talk a little bit about my week before we get into that. I had a interesting little experience this week of I do some mentoring as a lawyer, and this week I had the pleasure of mentoring one of the former cast members of the Trailer Park Boys, who's also a lawyer and is the newest legal aid lawyer in Port Hawkesbury, Nova Scotia. It's Mr. Barry Dunn, who played Ray, that is Ricky's father on the Trailer Park Boys. He was one of the writers and creators of the show. Really nice gentleman, and he's coming into the criminal practice. And I said to him that there's going to be a crime wave. We were meeting somebody in custody together, and I introduced him, and the guy in custody was like, "I know who you are." So it's going to be some interesting experiences there, both ways. So he's going to do a great job for the people in the area. So that was interesting. And then I ended the week with a criminal law conference sponsored by the Canadian Bar Association up in Halifax with judges and lawyers from across Nova Scotia giving presentations. So some interesting things there, and I'll reference some of that as we get into some of the topics here today. But Paul Palango, how's it going in your world? What's going on this week?
Well, I didn't go to any conferences, um, but I had a really sort of exciting week as usual. Um, where to begin? It was a good week and a bad week at the same time. So I'll do the good stuff first. Um, I got I've been asked to do a piece in the Globe and Mail, celebrating or such as it is, or marking the fifth anniversary of the Nova Scotia mass shootings, an 850 word piece that's supposed to run sometime near the time of the anniversary, 19th. I did a draft of it the last couple of days, and we'll see how it goes, if they like it or don't like it or whatever. Um, and they're sort of hanging it on the publication too of the next book, Anatomy of a Cover-Up, coming out on June 10th. That was a good thing. I was also contacted for the first time in 30 years of writing about police. I've been contacted by a number of high-profile uh, people in the police community to participate in some discussions about for policing and reforms in policing. And so I'll be doing that in the next couple of weeks as well. Um, so that's the good positive side of this. As as for the negative side, I had a couple of sort of angry readers and customers get a hold of me during the week. One was someone who finally got around to reading my book, 22 Murders, and sent me a note saying, "Your book, 22 Murders, is terrible. Get your facts straight." Woman who had a sort of Scotch, very common with Nova Scotia, and said to her, "Please, thank you for your opinion. Can you tell me what the mistakes were I made?"
Yeah,
Here I am 6 days later, still waiting
yeah.
for the answer. And then the next day, I got a weird, threatening phone call from a man who Sharon answered the phone, and the person was very polite to her. And I was down cutting glass at her glass studio, and she told me to pick up the phone, so I went and grabbed the phone. and I had this guy sort of, what seemed to be a fake voice, um, try and be nasty and belligerent to me. And at one point said, I heard you just turned on your tape recorder. And I said, oh, no, I didn't turn on my tape recorder. And then they told me that I think the question was something like this: what's it like to be a fly ball? I don't know if he meant like a baseball fly ball,
Eyeball.
if he meant an insect, and I was like, my nether parts were very small, or I was a piece of dung. I'm not sure what he meant by fly ball, but then he hung up.
That's a very confusing threat.
It sort of sounded good, but as I said, I've
Yeah.
been through worse by better people. And it gets into like, people think, oh, you go do this work and you're a journalist, and it's also cushy. You're making millions of dollars of doing this. Not true. We're making maybe dozens of dollars occasionally. The other thing is, there's all kinds of people who threaten you. It's the ones who you don't hear from that are the scary ones.
Yeah.
You must get it too. You must get threats.
Yeah, I do. And just by the way, just programming note, as we approach the fifth anniversary, I think planning on doing some special programming here in commemoration of that, reflecting back on it and talking about your upcoming book as well. So yeah, I do. I wouldn't say I get serious threats. Like if I did, I would contact authorities and by the way, Paul, if somebody threatens you, that is a crime. If somebody threatens me, it's actually two crimes or a different crime. There's the actual uttering of threats. That's an independent crime. But trying to intimidate somebody within the justice system is a separate and distinct offense. So I'm not sure if that alone is because most people probably wouldn't know that, has any deterrent effect on people. But most people are no, I don't get a ton of threats. I get some comments, usually secondhand, indirect through staff or through other people, like, oh yeah, how do you do that? How do you represent somebody like that? But physical threats or anything that's really concerning has been pretty rare over the close to 20 years I've been at this.
Well, as you know, 2 years ago, we someone was arrested and convicted of threatening Sharon and I, because of sort of the fallout from the stories on the Nova Scotia massacres. And the point is, I've been doing this for a long, long time, and I never let fear govern me. I mean, the problem we have in society today is that people are overly governed by fear. Donald Trump has made his entire career as a politician about scaring people, and people are easily scared. I mean, it starts with the fear of God. Um, and they're not rationally thinking about their situations and why people are threatening them and how serious they're not evaluating how serious it is. I mean, there's been 3 or 4 good articles this week. I think in the Washington Post, New York Times, the New Yorker, and elsewhere about cowardice. How we've got ourselves into a situation politically and economically because we have so many people who are afraid of everything, afraid of losing their pension, afraid of this, they're afraid of that. They're not thinking rationally, and they allow themselves to be manipulated. You and I are not the kind of people who are easily manipulated because we're not governed by fear and emotion.
There are others though, Paul, that are like I watched some of these activities down in the US, and what's really drawn my attention has been some of these big law firms that have been, well, they're being intimidated by the government, like people that either represented Hillary Clinton, worked with special counsel Jack Smith, or represented anybody that was really opposed to the Trump administration practices. They're being targeted by the Trump administration. And so it's really putting a chill. And it seems like major law firms are reacting to this in certainly a way that you wouldn't describe as brave. You see this, they're rejecting work, or they're rejecting work that would see them taking on the Trump administration. And I see this sometimes with law firms even here in Nova Scotia, larger law firms that don't want to take on the government, don't want to take on, institutions because either they have some work through them, maybe unrelated, that's not a direct conflict, but they see it as a business conflict. Like there's legal conflicts, you can't represent both sides or against a former client, but then there's these what they call, yeah, business conflicts where you just don't want to take on that side, and that's really goes against a lawyer's ethics, or the highest level of ethics. Right under the code of professional conduct, it says we have the obligation to raise fearlessly every issue, advance every argument, and ask every question, no matter how distasteful, and if it helps your client's case. And you're not supposed to be afraid to take on a client just because of the institutional weight on the other side.
And the worst thing is, you've got people who actually think this is a good thing
Oh yeah.
because they haven't thought through the issue and they haven't thought through the fallout from this and the consequences of this. And you have law firms who are so addicted to the big money, making $3,000 and $4,000 a year in the state, or an hour in the states. Get $1 million or $2 million is no big deal for handling a case, and the same in to a lesser extent in Canada. It's not about the money. People keep saying, and I keep reiterating, they keep saying, we want government to run like a business. Well, you're seeing it in the States and to a lesser extent in Canada, where nobody stands up for principle because it's all about the money. You've got to think, we need courage, and people have to be courageous. I mean, one of the articles I read pointed out that the issue of courage has been muted by the fact that, over the last 30, 40 years, we've had this entire movement driven by neoliberalism, basically, and the pursuit of money that, well, talk things out. We've got to find common ground. Well, sometimes there is no common ground. Sometimes you have to stand firm and fight the good fight. And yeah, it could be aggravating. It could be uncomfortable, but the chances of you dying because you took a stand and losing everything is, I think, rather remote compared to the benefits to society at large. That's
The
my
other
speech
way
for
of
that.
looking at it too, or a similar way of looking at it, is like, all right, you show that you can stand up to this institution and demonstrate some courage. Well, there might be other people who want to stand up to that institution as well. They're going to see somebody in the position of, representation of a legal representative. They're like, oh, that's the
Well,
lawyer I want.
absolutely. Like when I started doing the investigation 5 years ago, my investigation into the massacres in Nova Scotia, and wrote 22 Murders, I had someone who was close to us read the book, and their conclusion at the end was, well, the big problem here is that the RCMP needs better communication with each other. And they missed the whole point about accountability, wrongdoing, all of that stuff. But that's endemic in society. That, oh, well, we need better communication, a softer, gentler approach, and things will work better. We're in the positions we are because that sort of thinking has infected governments and businesses all the way along, because really it's a business practice. Smooth things over so we can sell more.
Yeah.
And that applies, and that's not a good thing in government. You need people to take a stand.
There was one of the pieces, one of the presentations at the conference was about appeals. And there's lots of appeals now, and all the jailhouse lawyers are advising if you're going to appeal, one of the things you should raise as a ground of appeal is ineffective assistance of counsel. All right. And this happens sometimes. The lawyer doesn't do a good job. It's rare that they work, but they're often attempted. Well, one of the things that can be seen as ineffective is if your counsel, your lawyer encourages you to make a deal and always make a deal and won't fight on any issue. And the advice is sometimes you just can't agree and you have to let the court make a decision and you have to push the issue. And you can't just resolve everything through negotiation. Sometimes you have to make it, have a decision made.
That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, speaking of profiles and courage, this week, lack thereof, I guess this is pretty much a week ago. It was amazing to me. This was an election issue. I was kind of amazed that it dragged out for more than 10 minutes, but it actually dragged out all weekend from a Friday revelation that a Liberal candidate, MP Paul Chiang, an Ontario MP, was found to have uh, encouraged supporters to, I guess, turn in for a bounty, for a reward. His conservative opponent, Joe Tay, who was who is, I guess, an advocate for Hong Kong, for the rights of the people of Hong Kong, which are, people have been following that know that that's really cracked down since the British turned it back over to the Chinese authorities. And so there was a reward issued for Joe Tay, and Paul Chiang, the Liberal candidate, was saying, "Yeah, people, turn him in. Wouldn't that be great?" And well, was he joking or not joking? Boy, it wasn't very funny. Most people agreed that there was no way that this Paul Chiang was going to continue as a candidate for as long as it took the Liberal Party to do the paperwork. But Prime Minister Carney stuck with him, supported him in a news conference, and it started Friday. It took until Monday when Paul Chiang actually announced that he was stepping down. Now, of course, he was forced into it, I'm sure, to resolve the situation. Not exactly not exactly courageous in the sense that we're just thinking about.
Well, like you had ties to the Conservative Party. I have no ties to anyone. I had someone call the other day asking if I'd give support to the Liberal candidate, and I says I would, even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. I don't tell you who I vote for, and I don't support anyone. I never put up a lawn sign. I would never do anything like that. And I treat politicians like I treat cars. I don't have brand loyalty. I buy the best car available at the time for the best price. You
Switch
know,
them every few years.
I just don't get brand loyalty awards. So
Yeah.
but what this told me about Carney is something we talked about last week and in previous weeks, how politicians are enamored with cops. They hold cops up to be ex-cops up to be these paragons of virtue, and we don't want to get in their way. These are good people. These are the best of the best. Some of them are, but some of them aren't. And Chiang, I did some research on Chiang. He was on the York Regional Police, which is the suburb north of Toronto. And he was in New York Regional Police for what, 25 years or something like that. And
Long
I talked
time.
to people in the Toronto area and in policing in the Toronto area, and they said as a police officer, Chiang was more than a desk cop. And he spent a lot of time inside, basically was considered very political. Surprise, surprise, he ended up being a politician.
Yeah.
Um, he wasn't the kind of cop who was out there, proving his worth day and night. He was one of those other carpet cops, as we call the Mounties, who basically do that kind of work and never push a cruiser anywhere. So it gets down to what we're talking about. What is Carney thinking? You look at a cop, just because somebody was a cop once doesn't mean they're the smartest, knife in the drawer or the most honest person. It just goes with the turf. And I think politicians at every level have to be more wary of the police and ex-police they deal with. Evaluate them just like they evaluate anyone else.
Seems like Carney's, the reason he's been so successful and gone so high in the polls is his international finance experience. His blind spot or his weakness is lack of political experience. And this seemed to really show it. I mean, the one thing he kind of learned as a politician seemed to be, all right, trust the police, support the police. Maybe that's one of the first lessons you get taught as a political novice. Uh, but it just seemed obvious to everybody else that was following politics that this guy couldn't stand. he did apologize. Now, maybe because he was a police officer, Carney felt that that was going to be enough to satisfy the public, and it certainly seemed to satisfy him as the leader. But it just, yeah, it seemed so clear that he was toast as soon as that news came out. But Carney didn't seem to see it that way. So be curious to see if there's any fallout from it. Maybe it's just another lesson learned on the way as in his political tutelage.
Well, and the thing with Carney is they're about even with the conservatives in the latest polls, which means he's ahead because the conservative vote is so concentrated in ridings in the West that where they might run up 60 or 70% in the vote, but that doesn't translate into the tighter, more populous regions of Ontario and Quebec, where races are closer, and the Liberals only have to get 38% to win a seat.
Yeah. No, it's a big anyway, it's a big issue. Yeah, and the NDP that vote seems to be collapsing all over the country under Jagmeet Singh, so they'll benefit from that. Still lots of time to go and debates to come and lots of stuff to happen yet in the election campaign, but that was certainly something significant this week. And we don't talk a lot of politics on this podcast, but because of the police officer connection, it seemed like something important to touch on. There's a couple of other Canadian stories we wanted to get into a little bit. Paul, there's two, I guess, the Indigenous law related issues. There was a story that came out. I'll hold back the New Brunswick RCMP situation with the CERT report that came out this week, and maybe start first with the Nova Scotia government announcement on Friday that they're going to attempt, I'm saying they're going to attempt to regulate cannabis on First Nation reserves. You go through Truro, you go through Wakaba, you'll see there's a plethora of privately owned cannabis dispensaries. The government is now saying that they are going to restrict that. They are going to require that, just like the rest of Nova Scotia, where you can get cannabis legally at NSLC outlets, that on Indigenous First Nations reserves, that will also be the case. They'll have to have the NSLC stamp on it. There's a limit of 30 grams per transaction, no sampling on site, and it'll be just like going into an NSLC. Seems to me like there's no indication that they've really negotiated with the bands, with the chiefs, communities on this. And I say good luck. It seems like the toothpaste is out of the tube, and it's going to be very difficult to go back and force, because that's what it would be at this point, force some of these private outlets to close down. I mean, when you go through these communities, it seems like it must be a problem, but it's an existing, I guess, economic situation. What do you think? Is that going to be possible for the government to impose this new regime on these First Nation reserves, Paul?
Well, it's going to be extremely difficult, but the major issue here is, yes, you said the toothpaste is out of the tube, but it was a giant tube and there was a lot of toothpaste that wasn't cigarettes. I mean, if you go back over the last 30 to 40 years, one of the problems with First Nation communities is the level of criminality that's been allowed to sort of grow in some of these communities. I mean, I grew up in Southern Ontario, and it was quite clear that there was a direct relationship between organized crime and some high-ranking members in some of the First Nations communities, which led to cigarette smuggling and other sort of drug smuggling and whatever. It made some people fabulously rich, but it was more than that. Once they established these roots in these First Nation communities to sort of smuggle drugs and cigarettes across the border, almost with impunity. The same routes were used to smuggle guns, ammunition, and other things across the border. And so now we have this problem of a flow of guns coming in, especially at reserves in Cornwall, Ontario, like on the border of Quebec, Ontario, and in other sort of communities right down the line where you have land borders. And the First Nations communities themselves, in those communities, they've been wrestling with it. I know in New Brunswick, over the last couple of years, there have been movements to get criminal elements out of the community so they could have a normal life there. But it's almost impossible to do because the criminal elements rise up, wrap themselves in the flag, and saying, "We're fighting for our rights. This is our land." Da, 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 da. All of that stuff. It makes it, and they're intimidating the lawful citizens who live there. And the police, essentially the RCMP, who do most of the federal policing on those communities, are essentially invisible. They make an arrest here or there, but the structure stays in place. So if you're going to shut down all of these things, they're essentially being run by criminal enterprises with ties to the Hells Angels and other organized crime outlets. It's going to be very difficult because the general population will, talking about the lack of courageous people or people with lack of insight, don't see the real issue. All they see is, oh, it's the natives against us. Give the natives what they want. But giving the natives what they want doesn't help a lot of the First Nations communities who, the top dogs, the people connected to crime and smuggling are making all kinds of money, and the communities themselves have no water because none of the money is going into those communities.
Yeah, it's true. Like when this all happened, when Trudeau was elected and everything was going to be, cannabis was going to be legalized, the question came out, well, is this going to be all government regulated, like in Nova Scotia through the NSLC liquor stores, or is it going to be private enterprise and be allowed to operate according to the free market? And it was never really established how that was going to happen on First Nations reserves. And then it became, nobody was dictating how it was going to go. And then in that vacuum, entrepreneurs developed these dispensaries and it was allowed to happen. Nobody tried to shut it down. There's been some limited attempts. I know in Southwest or Southeast, in the Valley, I think area in Nova Scotia, there've been some raids, but only where there's been some clear evidence, I think, or purported clear evidence of things happening beyond that, other drugs beyond what's permitted. So now what do you do, right? It's the same thing as happening in the fishery with the Elver fishery and the lobster fishery. It's like, well,
But the same people, Adam,
yeah,
I know from a reserve near us, First Nation reserve near us, where they took away the huts where they'd set up operations. They towed them away. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and a big demonstration. And there's a Shell gas station there, and they put chains on the gas station. The people who were doing this, who got arrested, and their supporters shut down the station, shut down the reserve. But the very same people who were running that were doing the illegal Elvers as well.
yeah,
I know firsthand. Like it's the same group of people, a small part of the community who are intimidating everyone else in the community.
yeah.
And
So
nobody can stand up to them. And the politicians, the courageous politicians,
yeah,
they don't stand up, won't do anything.
well, there's a lot of, there's a small voting pool in each of one of these First Nations. And so, if you get 30, 40 people and their families that are connected, employed through the dispensaries, well, that's a voting block. And so are you going to upset them, fishermen connected to that and their families? You're going to upset them? Probably not. In fact, there's probably pressure on the chiefs and council to stick up for this and maintain it. But I didn't see any. So this was the indications in the story from Friday. First of all, it was Friday afternoon, stories coming out from the government. It's something that they don't really want to promote. They're not really pushing. And the second part was no comments from chiefs or council or anybody prominent on the Indigenous side to say, yeah, we agree with this and we were involved in this. So I think this is going to unfold poorly, and we'll be watching as it does.
And one more thing on the announcement. Friday afternoon, in the middle of Donald Trump
Yeah.
imposing tariffs around the world and all the turmoil around the world and the stock market collapsing and farmers crying for more money and help in the states. The very same people who voted for Trump,
Yeah.
who said he's going to do this.
Yes.
I just might add, it's just, yeah, the government will do this, slip it through there because they know no one's paying attention and they're watching everything else. And we have no media whatsoever following up. We keep hammering away at this. We have no media who can drive a story, pick up a story, get behind the story, and show the public convincingly what's happening.
So we'll go a little bit west into New Brunswick, and this is the story where I saw there were media articles on the from CTV, CBC, Global, and APTN on this, and this was an unfortunate. It was a death in Elsie Bucktug, New Brunswick. The individual's name is Stephen Dedan. Nickname was Iggy. He was shot by an RCMP officer September 8th of last year. And this was about quarter after 11 p.m. The officers were called to this residence. Mr. Dedan was not well, and he was making threats of self-harm, threats to harm others. Two officers showed up. Dedan had a large knife. He also had throwing axes. You look at the CERT report. This is the Serious Incident Response Team. This is the body that oversees or that examines when there's been an injury caused by a police officer, whether criminal charges are warranted. So the CERT report showed some photos of these axes, and it's not like it's about the size of a hatchet, a little smaller, but a throwing axe. I mean, you could throw that a good distance fairly accurately if you were practiced a little bit with it. So Mr. Dedan had these hatchets and was threatening the officers, threw one at them, just missed, not the officer that shot him, but the other officer. One officer got him with a taser, was ineffective, and he kept coming. He was ready to throw the second hatchet and was shot 3 times and was killed. So seems like Dedan, he was in a mental health crisis of some sort. Maybe it was an attempt to do a death by police officer, but it was a terrible situation for the police officers to be confronting, and for the people in the home. There were many others in the home, and controversial situation. What are your initial thoughts on this one, Paul?
Well, there's all kinds of it's a sad situation. The mental, it seems apparent there was a mental health issue. You can't just, that you're going to get people say, well, we should have sent some sort of professional there to deal with it and talk him down. I keep bringing up at the James Smith Cree First Nation in Saskatchewan a couple of years ago, when the two brothers went on a rampage and stabbed and killed 10 people. One of the first people killed was a counselor who worked with the police going to talk down situations. That's not highlighted, but that's a dangerous situation to be in. It's a dangerous situation for the police to be in. The RCMP has become, First Nations talk about this right across the country. RCMP is not very effective in dealing with First Nations problems, don't know the community very well, tend to have rotating officers through a lot of these communities. It's very difficult work. They're understaffed, undertrained, underprepared, and they're easily scared. You have people operating as police officers who do not have all the physical skills required to handle that kind of situation. It's easy to pull a gun out. They pulled a taser out, it didn't work.
Yeah.
It's a difficult situation, but I think that the police have to be able to do better. And there's, the RCMP talks a good game about we're doing this and we're doing that and we're working with the community and our clients in the community. But the evidence is, especially in New Brunswick, there's been multiple cases in the last couple of years of the RCMP shooting First Nations people, male and female, in questionable circumstances. CERT has cleared them, and as as you've read in 22 Murders and in Anatomy of a Cover-Up coming up, you'll learn why I don't have much confidence in CERT evaluating any police action, because the force, what it did during the Nova Scotia massacres, has forever tainted them until until they can be reformed. I don't care who's in charge; they don't have credibility.
No, it's a tough one. I read the report. So the director, Aaron Noss, seemed very
Do you agree
careful
with it?
to be sensitive about, the potential allegations of racial bias, and speaking about those and saying, all right, well, we recognize this is an issue. We're not here to deal with all that. That's not our place to make recommendations. But, trying to, I guess, ward off that criticism in advance. Potential for perception of bias was certainly there. There was a comment in the report that the officer who actually, I think, did the shooting had dealt with the same Mr. Dedan a week prior and had actually de-escalated him from whatever was happening then, and was trying to sort of remind him of that interaction and hoping for the same result. Didn't happen, of course. There was an organization in El Sabuktug called Indige Watch, from Indige, INDIGE dash Watch. And it's an organization of, kind of sheriff level, it sounds like, Indigenous officials that will come to assist with situations. But they were contacted. They were contacted a little later to deal with it because there was a crowd gathering right after the shooting, and the officers felt they were in danger, and things were getting quite heated. So they were brought in to deal with the crowd. They were a little offended that they weren't brought in to deal with the situation, but they also said, well, they don't deal with situations where there's weapons involved. So they couldn't have dealt with the situation, but wished they had been contacted at least to be aware of it. So.
And that's the issue. I mean, we need some serious reforms there, but it's not going to happen as long as the RCMP are basically trying to maintain this kind of policing in these First Nations communities. You've noticed that where the RCMP has been pushed out in places like Membertou and Eskasoni in Cape Breton, and Cape Breton Regional Police have been running it, things seem to have been running smoothly for the last couple of years. And there seems to be a good relationship between the First Nations and the municipal police force who are taking this under contract. The RCMP is not wired to do this job properly.
No, I think we'll see more of that kind of structure maybe after 2032 when things get reformed. We'll stay tuned for that. There was, in this case, I'll just close with, there was video of the situation too. They had a home security system, and those body-worn cameras were engaged as well. So there was some of that. All right, Paul. I want to get to a couple of other stories. The shooting in Nashville, there was a report on a school shooting. We'll come to that, and in a situation out of Ontario. But before that, we've started a feature called Between the Lines, and wanted to talk this week a little bit about the cold case of Helen Knickle. I'm saying, is it Knickle or Nickel? Knickle, out of Halifax.
I can't really say nickel. That's silent K.
All right. Yeah, so you're familiar with this case. I read a little bit of it this week, but maybe
You want me to go ahead here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, back in, Helen Nickel was murdered on July 26, 1974 in Halifax. She went for a walk in the middle of the night between 1 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. And approximately 3 a.m., her unresponsive body was found on the Halifax North Commons. And anyone who's been to Halifax knows where the Commons is, just north of the Citadel, the big park. During the winter, they have a big skating rink there. It's a baseball field, soccer fields, whatever. And that it's surrounded by low-rise condominiums. Back then, it would just have been houses. So 50 years later, last July, the Halifax Regional Police announced that they were still continuing their investigation into Helen Nichols' death. And they put up a reward of $150,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the person responsible. It sounded like, to the public, it sounded like this was, the police are on top of this. They're digging away. They must be close. In other cases you've seen over the years, when the police make these kinds of announcements, they're obviously trying to flush someone. They're sometimes trying to flush someone out, have them say something, do something that they can catch them in the net. So this came and went last summer. They made their announcement, looked like they were doing their job. Since then, I've talked to, let's put it as several people aware of what's going on inside the Halifax Regional Police. And what they say is this was all marketing and public relations, because the biggest problem the Halifax Regional Police have is there is no evidence. They lost it all, or it was destroyed over the years. I beg the force to come forward and correct that, but I've been told that once, a couple of years ago, all the cold cases Halifax police had, they moved to Dartmouth, to a location in Dartmouth across the harbor into the former city of Dartmouth, which is now part of Halifax. And all the cold case evidence was locked up in a closet, not filed on Versadex, the recording system, CPIC, any of the systems. Nothing was carried forward or registered. And that when officers went in to look at that, eventually, or civilians went in to look at that, they found all kinds of missing evidence. Police officers were going into the lockup, taking things out when they needed it. Some were walking out with buckets of bullets to go shooting for on the weekend. No record keeping whatsoever. Evidence rotting to the point of making people vomit when they open boxes. So no care and control of anything. So I dare the Halifax police to come out and correct the record and tell the world that they actually do have evidence in the Helen Nichols and other cases. And they're not just blown smoke.
When you issue a reward that
That's my story.
size, which that's almost as big as your book advance, Paul, that's serious money. So they either expect
My
not to pay it.
lifetime book advance that up.
Okay. They must expect not to pay it, I guess, or because that's a lot for a 50-year-old case.
Well, they do this. This is their sort of the number. The Department of Justice puts up this money. There's a one in my area, Stephen Hall, who was murdered in 1996, and the gas stations still have $150,000 rewards for the finding the murder of Stephen Hall. But at the same time, there's a serial killer who was working in this area on the South Shore back in the 90s and was jailed eventually for other murders, may have been responsible. Evidence may have been destroyed. He never was followed up on. But they keep promoting the idea, we're still looking, we're still looking. When they pretty well may have known this, it may have been in their records. The records may have been destroyed, lost, whatever. Because they have the Halifax police, along with the RCMP, have done all kinds of strange things over the years with evidence, and that's been documented.
Well,
So
it must
it
be one
doesn't
of the
surprise me when they'll
Oh no, I was going to say that working these cold cases, it's either the easiest or second easiest job in policing. I don't know if undercover work sometimes, where you get to go to nice restaurants and travel around and all that, have all that fun is number one or not. But working cold cases, oh yeah, we're working on that. I mean, what do you do all day, right?
Well, like I said, I challenge them. Show me the evidence. Show someone the evidence because it's 50 years old. You made this press release. You made a big show of it. The killer is probably dead a long time ago.
Yeah,
So show me what you're doing now.
yeah, really. The killer under 20s would be in their 70s. So,
Yeah,
all right,
and
so
probably in jail a long time already if they were they
yeah,
were.
probably in on other things at some point at least. All right, well that's interesting. So maybe we'll hear from some police officers or people in the with some connection to Halifax Regional Police to see what's actually going on there. Get in touch. All right, Paul. So let's go do a quick trip down to the States. This Covenant school shooter story came out. The report came out this week. Touches on some issues we've discussed in other cases. And so I'll give the bare facts. So the shooting was in 2023, March 27th, 2023. Nashville Covenant School, most upper scale school, I think. And report issued this week said that the parents, counselors, and gun retailers, remember that part, of Audrey Hale, who was a biological female, was going by he, him pronouns, at least at some point, maybe not right at the shooting, was the parents, counselors, and gun retailers were cleared of any responsibility in the case. And the report, 48-page report, details how Audrey Hale concealed their intention from everybody and made notes in their private notebook about, okay, oh gee, my parents almost found out that I was making plans, trying to buy things with cash, not be tracked online, had bought a Columbine book to, read about what inspired the Columbine shooters. So uh, to me, Paul, this well, a few things surprised me. One was that this person who's had counselors and was had mental health crises, plural, was still permitted to own guns. Their parents allowed them to have guns. At one
God
point,
bless America. God bless America.
amazing, right? So we've seen this in Michigan, and I think the other one might have been in one of the Carolinas, where parents were found liable for the actions of their children in shooting situations where they allowed or were, indifferent to gun ownership by very troubled teens and, just weren't supervising them properly. Counselors were unaware, teachers seemed unaware. But in this case, Audrey Hale had guns and was given back guns, and at one point under the promise of that she was going to sell them. It's like, oh, we'll just trust you to sell them then. Go ahead. Why not? Anyway, that kind of blew me away. But what it tells me is that now I'm seeing after those other decisions, the Michigan one in particular, parents and counselors, school officials are insulating themselves from liability, trying to say, oh, I didn't see that coming, and trying to prove along the way, like, oh, see, she was hiding this actively from us. And that's why we didn't see it coming, and that's why we're not liable. Uh, Not sure that's the proper conclusion in this case.
Well, the other thing that strikes me about this case that has an application to what happened in Nova Scotia with the massacres, then the subsequent Mass Casualty Commission, was the Mass Casualty Commission took the position driven by basically by the Liberal government and by politicians who wanted to keep a lid on things, that everything would be trauma informed. And we're not going to discuss the innermost things of this that might traumatize people. And this is in the public interest. It certainly wasn't in the public interest. What happened in this case was the police and courts wanted to keep her writings from the public. And she was documenting what she wanted to do and how she was going to do it. And eventually, she concealed everything from her parents and therapists, but kept a detailed diary of her thinking. And eventually, this has come out. A 48-page report was released last week showing what she was doing, what she was thinking, and it's instructive. It's much like the series Adolescence that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Instructive for parents to read this and understand that when they're being lied to, maybe they'll recognize it. Maybe somebody else will recognize it. They'll be able to help help other people. But to keep a lid on things officially because you don't want to be embarrassed or you want to be protected from the law is not what we should be doing in this day and age. I mean, openness is what is required. And I think that, getting a hold of this and reading what she was thinking, what she did, is very helpful.
In this case, they've given ownership of the papers, the documents that the killer has created, to the families of the victims.
Yes.
And so it's up to them to disclose it, but they're not going to. They're going to withhold it. So that's.
I mean, she had a mental health history from the time she was 6 years old.
Yeah.
And she was able to, she went into transitioning, was able to buy guns, and repeatedly buying guns, making threats, fantasizing about this, even delaying the attack till there was the perfect time because she wanted to lull people to sleep that she wasn't going to do it, and then she did it.
So signs to watch for, and that should be known for parents to take some lessons from it.
Oh, absolutely. And it's getting it out there is very important. And it really, really bothers me when you get people who are sort of determined not to get the evidence out because it's too embarrassing, it's hurtful. That's the definition of cowardice.
By the way, Paul, for anybody that thinks, those right-wing nut jobs, what are they thinking here? I would commend you to a CBC Ideas podcast from this week that talks about children and how we are not doing them any favors by maintaining their innocence to the extent that we have been.
And, absolutely, absolutely. Like you've got and I've seen it in people close to us. This putting a buffer around kids, not letting them be kids, not letting them discover, controlling every moment of their lives, and making them afraid of everything. Like sapping the courage out of the kids. Kids have to learn they're not your possessions.
Yeah.
But there's so many parents are out there fretful, afraid of afraid of everyone, and you've even got law enforcement people who are afraid of everything. This culture of cowardice.
Yeah,
we're paying for it now. What we're seeing going on is a direct effect of this culture of cowardice that we've been developing for 50 years.
Yeah, very much so. All right, well, that's so I want to jump to this last story out of Ontario because I think it's really interesting. And it talks about a situation that is very prominent in legal circles now, which is delay in getting cases to trial. There was a presentation on Friday at the conference I attended, and it was the guy who's a Generation X lawyer as well as I am, talking about Jordan. So this is Jordan is the name of the Supreme Court of Canada case that puts a hard limit of 18 months in provincial court, 30 months in superior courts for cases to get to trial. And his comment was, he had the Michael Jordan, Air Jordan logo up. He said, Jordan used to be a great thing. Just the name Jordan used to inspire, warm feelings or whatever. Now it is scary to people. But it's such a good thing in the legal system to have these deadlines because, cases that should be getting to trial are now getting there. And it's making everybody go faster. I have some ideas on how to make it even better. But this situation, Paul, so the guy was found, he had $70,000 in cash, 400 OxyContin pills, 8 kilograms of cocaine. So this guy, if he was convicted, would be going away for a long time. It took 29 months to get to trial. So actually just under the 30-month limit, but there were disclosure issues. And in particular, so in drug cases, there's usually possession for the purpose of trafficking. There's usually two defenses. One is the search was improper. The second is, well, he only had 3 or 4 grams that was personal use. So it's not trafficking. So bigger cases, you often focus on that first part in the search. Well, to get a search, the police need to apply for a search warrant and they need to provide information. Sometimes that comes from confidential informants, and so things are blacked out. You have to, as a defense lawyer, wait for that information to obtain, ITO to be provided to you before you can give good advice to your client as to what they should be doing. You know, if the ITO is weak, you attack it, and that's a charter argument. If it's solid, you're probably getting into resolution discussions. In this case, they waited 6 months to deliver that, which is a very long time. It should only take a couple of weeks, a meeting between the lawyer and the police officers to figure out what can be disclosed and what can't. In this case, it took 6 months. That was criticized. Then the Crown, it was going to be heard in provincial court, which had an 18-month limit. The Crown said, no, we're going to do a direct indictment to Supreme Court with a 30-month limit. And so it was a manipulation of procedural tactics on the Crown part. And then they were still running up against the 30-month delay. Judge threw it out and said that's improper. And it was a serious issue that needs to be addressed by the police and the Crowns. What did you see then?
The problem with Jordan, is that the police now cannot make, like the RCMP, for example, cannot make a major drug investigation without an informant. They can't go after bikers without an informant already on side. The bikers and their lawyers know that. So an investigation goes down. You'll see the headlines of the major arrests, everyone getting charged. And the next thing you know, the cases either disappear or the major players caught perhaps $1 million worth of methamphetamine or cocaine get very light sentences. Why? Because the lawyers know that there's an informant. They probably know who the informant is, and they strike it. Their negotiating position is, we're going to name your informant, and we're going to get at your informant. And the Crown doesn't want to give that up. Things get stalled. They make deals. People either get released whole as bolus, or they get minor charges. It's a real corruption of the system, but it goes back to the laws have basically constrained the police. The police, especially the RCMP, not very good at mounting serious cases. And so you've got criminals walking the street who should be in jail.
This, yeah,
At
serious.
least agree with that.
That was very great. Well, we only have a few minutes left, so I wanted to I'll tell you my idea, and it connects. I was watching Blue Jays pitcher Chris Bassett yesterday. He made his second return back to New York to pitch against the Mets. Chris Bassett has about 10 different pitches, and so he used to take forever to get through a game. Now there's a pitch clock, and you can't do it. You've got to be ready to go in 15 seconds and throw the next pitch. If you go to court, you will hear decisions by judges that take an hour to deliver. And the only part that the accused cares about is the last 30 seconds. Or sometimes they'll give the decision right away and then explain it. But it's laid it out. You go for a sentencing decision, even if it's a joint recommendation, sometimes it could take half an hour. There's only so much time, court time, and to use it so inefficiently as it's used. The reason is everybody's worried about being appealed for insufficiency of reasons, or missing some point, or they're trying to get to the Court of Appeal, so they want to write a great decision that everybody admires. And it's not serving the general public in the way that, anyway, it leads to a lot of delays because it uses up so much judicial time to write the decisions, to deliver them, and for who? Like, it's not for the public or for the accused. Those decisions, there should be a time limit on these, and I'd like to see some changes with that. So we'll see if anyway, the court system should follow the great game of baseball. On board, Paul?
I agree. I agree.
All right, so let's go from the greatest
Last point.
last point. Yes, I'll let you talk about this historic day we just had.
This gets back to Wayne Gretzky. Today Alexander Ovechkin scored the goal that put him ahead of Gretzky. And I watched the highlight. It was a real goal, a beauty.
It was a nice goal.
You know, a nice sharp shot from like 25 feet out, beat the goalie, no small feat. You know, and I think that I want to get into a few stats, but I'll let you go first.
All right. Well, as somebody who's been very critical of this situation and supportive of Wayne Gretzky, here's my stance right now is I shouldn't be more upset than he is. And he wasn't upset. He was happy. He was there. I'm sure he's glad to not have to follow him around for a few more games and glad he scored and get it over with. But Gretzky was very gracious and shook his hand and was proud of him and said all the right things as he always does. So there you go. We'll see. I don't know who the next one, some Canadian will hopefully break the record in years to come.
So here's the point. Last point on Gretzky. Who's better, Gretzky or Ovechkin? I've made the point in the past that Ovechkin had tougher situation, giant goalies with pads, playing at high speed. I just had the idea this morning. I said, I'm going to look it up. Average goals per season scored in the NHL going back to World War II. And if you look at Gretzky's era from roughly 1980 to 1999, for the first part of Gretzky's era, from 81 on, especially, average goals were 3.95, almost 4 goals per game, 3.5 goals per game until 1994, when it went down to 2.89 and things started to get tougher, and his scoring sort of diminished as he was older because it was down to 2.53, 2.56. So it was at 4 when he started. So it was a much looser league compared to back in the late 60s, early 70s, when it was almost a goal a game less, 2.75, 2.88. Gretzky's era, previously, the only era of the NHL where goals were being scored at 3.6, 4 goals a game, was at the middle of World War II, when all the players were overseas or in the army. So there were very few good players. Getting back to Ovechkin, so Gretzky was at an era where it was 3.8 to 4 goals a game. Ovechkin's entire career has been in an era where it's 2.54, 2.51 goals a game. Bigger goalies, faster game, better scorer. He's the real deal. He was the real deal. Gretzky wouldn't score that many goals in this situation, the way hockey's played now.
He's in his 50s. Actually, he's in his 60s. The old Ty Cobb line. I'm 80 years old. Of course, I'd only hit 350. No, that's great, and you got to give credit to Ovechkin, reluctantly or however. But that's.
There's a wonderful article I think in the Washington Post today about how Ovechkin beats goalies. That goalies say he mystifies them. They know where he's going to be, and they still can't stop him. And he's not one of these guys who's scoring from a scramble or tipping things in. Like the goal he scored to go past Gretzky today was beautiful.
Yeah, it was a long shot. He's a little
down the ice, and he loitered at the blue line. He didn't rush in. Yeah. He loitered behind the play. The puck comes to him, and boom, it's in the net.
Yeah, he's more of a Brett Hull style, or maybe Mike Bossy. I'm not sure, but
like Mike Bossy, Brett Hull.
Yeah. So, well, that's it's great to see, I guess, in a sense. But anyway, we'll see what happens next.
There you are.
Yeah. All right, folks. So we'll be back next week for another episode of Dispersing the Fog. Hope everybody enjoys this, the video and the podcast. We appreciate you being here. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.